Hello, students. We are going to study international journalism within the context of the book that we have. In fact, it's good to have a general discussion, but then there is a textbook, so it's good to discuss it within the context of textbook for exams and other stuff. And also, there are some key points that needs to be explained. I'll begin with the first chapter, which is the introduction, the changing nature of foreign correspondence. And the book, as I've written, is International Journalism by Kevin Williams. First and foremost, it's the importance of international journalism. As Williams says that in our modern times, international journalists are highly respected due to their role in deciding policy matters. And for that very reason, as we discussed in the class, they have a very close interaction with policymakers and embassies wherever they work, if they are on their international beats. And if we look at international journalism, there is a debate going on that this is kind of an end of era of international correspondence or international journalism. The reason we use the word correspondence is because the correspondents are normally people who work in places other than their headquarters, the newspaper or any media headquarters, and they are working in a place from where the media outlet doesn't operate. This is also an old definition, but international correspondence means that a journalist who works in country other than the home country of this any news organization. Then we see that in the modern era, there is a change of focus from international journalism to a journalism that we know as global journalism. Why is that? These are the important questions that we need to answer. As we all know that foreign correspondents or international journalists are people who provide information about other countries and about your own country in the rest of the world. So these are the people who make sure that you have a world view, and this world view pretty much engages societies and also decides for what we consider as a world order. But as we see in the age of globalization, this focus has changed. What is globalization like? We won't go into the academic debate or the scholarly debate at this moment, but looking at globalization from an international journalism or a media perspective, it's the rise of technology and the finance systems, and also travels that have been taking place all over the world. Like in terms of technology, if we go to the old practice of journalism, there is a lot of dependence upon technology that creates a role where there is a distance between the working journalist in any part of the world and the publishing house or the media organization which decides how much of the news will go and where. Right now we see that technology has made it possible for journalists to be in another part of the world and at the same time present in their workplaces through technology like mobile phones, for example. You have these portable technologies with which you don't need any other person to help you with it, and you just move with your cell phone and you record all kinds of information, and you can directly transmit it to people. These are live coverages that you get. So what has happened is because of these lightweight portable cameras and other stuff, you have an electronic news gathering structure instead of the earlier structures. And it's also the technological development has affected the old tradition of journalism, where we used to have long stay correspondents, like people who stayed in a part of the world and then they gathered information and they were part of the culture. They understood cultures and uh, most of the time they inform people in their home countries, like in the US, for example, or Europe or England, uh, with a flavor of the local. Right now, that's not possible because most of the time you get information about a country and you get in, you stay a few days, and most of the time we see these vloggers and other people who are moving in. And if a journalist is a good vlogger, then it becomes a lot more easier. Although right now vlogging is more about entertainment or individual enterprise, whereas journalism is still a specified field. But at the same time, we see a lot of freelancing happening because on the one hand, media organizations are having less money than they used to have earlier. On the other hand, individuals think that it's easier to work as freelancers where they can earn more money, especially when it comes to conflict zones and war zones. But the problem with it is that when you go freelancing and you take more risks, and somehow there is a debate that because of the risk factor and freelancing, there are more deaths in areas of conflict than these were earlier. Most of the people uh, who die or come in harm's way in international journalism and areas of conflict belong to those freelancing community, or even sometimes it's because of the competition that is brought by the freelancers. Even mainstream journalists don't adhere to the guidelines given by the organizations or wherever they are working, the local military arrangements of a country, or even of forces that are operating over there. So this is one of the most important aspects, is that there is a blurring of lines between international journalism and national journalism, because the reason for that is because it's a globalized world, and in which there are no home news abroad or uh, international news at home. The idea of home news abroad, international news home, is like this: that if, for example, right now, as the OIC summit is happening, we have international news at home. Like, or international dignitaries are here from many different Muslim countries, and when we cover that, we are covering international news at home. Like, but if our prime minister, for example, when he visited Russia, then we have home news abroad because our prime minister was there, so we were covering home news in another country. But right now, if you see the reason why all these apps like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and many others have, especially Twitter, has facilitated individuals to reach beyond political boundaries. And then there is a debate which influences international journalism, because journalists are also on these apps, and it has become very competitive. So it's not that easy. It's becoming increasingly complex. Uh, in terms of political agendas, also, it was easier to do international journalism earlier, because international journalism was somehow in spheres of black and white, like the good people and good bad people. Like during the Cold War, for example, the Western media decided that whoever is having a left leaning is bad, and whoever is with the West is good. And this was also the idea between the first, second, and third world. We belong to the third one, but somehow the good were the ones who were uh, on the west side. Uh, but right now that's not possible, because especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, the Western journalists did get a chance to get a uniform platform after 9/11, when there was war on terror. So war on terror was also a unifying factor in terms of the narrative for international journalism. but it was not easy. But it was good that international journalists, especially Western international journalists, are always seeking a grand narrative through which they can make sense of the world and also transmit it to other people. And this is also important to understand because in the 20th century, there was a lot of effort to sell wars. Now, how do you sell wars? You sell wars by international public relations. In national public relations, you try to sell somebody as a rogue element in the world, in world power. And if you are a powerful more country like the US, it's easy for you to blame somebody, to name somebody, to blame somebody, and then to kill somebody. Like Iraq is a big example. Libya, for example. Right now, it's happening in terms of Ukraine, where we have one side of the picture, but we don't know the whole. There was this debate in the 70s and in the 80s. There was a new World Information and Communication Order by UNESCO, something that we know as the McBride Commission, and it said, okay, there is one element. Point one is that we agree, the world community agreed that there is a lot of imbalance in the flow of information, which is creating a global narrative that is not in favor of the whole of the world, especially it is being built at the cost of the developing nations. So there were a lot of things that were tried. One of them was developing local news agencies, kind of regional ones in weaker countries. But these didn't work because it's about power. So countries who have power have dominance over the system. Although this power is being challenged by alternative narratives like Al Jazeera or others, but if you look at them also, these are also part of the global power structure. So when we look at international journalism today, we see that on the one hand, it has become more complex and it's not easy to develop a grand narrative. Like especially it happened when there were ethnic wars and religious wars in Europe, because then if you say this is good and bad within a European country, it doesn't work. But again, somehow somebody has to sell it. It was a difficult time for international journalism who were part of a narrative where some things are good and some things are bad. So they had to support the good and object to bad ones. But that's not simply because of that. There is another reason to it, which is that globalization, like the rise of technology, citizen journalism, like everybody's journalism now we see, has made it difficult for international news organizations to develop a mega narrative within which they can define a world and sell it to global populations. A way out of this dominance was a critique of what we know as objectivity, like uh, many critics said that it's a bystander journalism, like you just look at things happening and say, no, I'm simply objective. I'll just convey the 5 Ws in an H. That's my job. And if I go beyond that, it won't work. In many parts of the world, if we look at countries like ours and we try to define them within the context of international journalism, we will see only bad things happening, like nothing good happening in our part of the world. So many of journalists and scholars in these countries decided to go for development journalism. The development journalism was not uh, bystander journalism. It was more humane. It was looking at human situations and all the dominance of bad people over good and how people struggle, how people try to make their lives easier. It does work. The other aspect is basically peace journalism, which was highly criticized by Western journalists. They're saying, okay, when we see peace journalism, it means that nobody is at fault, and we are doing this, and we are doing advocacy. But then many journalists said that uh, this is not how it's going to work, because being neutral is not being objective. The very idea of objectivity was challenged. And the new journalism that we have is, as it's stated, that it says that if there is a commitment to detachment and neutrality, then we are not doing any service to humanity or any society. Like the ultimate goal of journalism is to help in developing a better society. If that's not happening, then we are not doing our own duty. And also we have also seen that uh, that whenever the idea of objectivity is supported, we see that the Western journalists themselves go into patriotic journalism. Patriotic journalism is a kind of journalism where like they 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 have their country's flag uh, on their pockets, and they also uh, wear military clothes and things like that, and they create an image of the world where America is doing good. So if you are okay with being embedded with any militaries, why is it wrong to work for peace, for work for justice, for work for development, and report it, because the bias is already there. Especially people like Rupert Murdoch were the ones who thought that there is no unbiased journalism. So they didn't go for unbiased journalism. They said, okay, what we'll do is that we'll report with a bias, and we'll give news. So when we see where journalism is right now and how effective it is, we can also see that news is sold in packages of entertainment. One big example is the U.S. program Comedy Central, where news is given in a critique of news is given within the context of entertainment, making fun of it. It's funny and it's understandable also, and people do think that we could make sense of what's going on in an entertainment way, which will also help us digest all this uh, problematic world. But on the other hand, it's a critique of the way the modern international journalism is creating the image of the world. So we see that uh, that that modern techniques of journalism, where individuals are doing a lot of work, and where there is the idea of detachment is being challenged, and also the idea of consumer journalism is being challenged. Like modern international journalism coupled with public relations and marketing techniques is also kind of selling global dreams. Like people are detaching from their individual lives or their communities or their societies, and they feel like being lost in their own countries. And this has become a global phenomenon, that people around the world are somehow unhappy with their immediate environments, which is not good. Uh, the end point for this whole discussion could be that journalism is changing. It has become a lot of like it is more individualistic when it comes to citizen journalism and involvement, but it's more confusing and complex, because on the one hand, the the typical international journalism, which believed in nation states and boundaries and goods and bad, uh, is dying. There is no more space for that. But at the same time, there is a global interactive narrative taking form. But that form is also being influenced by powerful nations around the globe who want to have control of the narrative, uh, within which we see that the silver linings are like when journalists unite to unearth global corruption, irrespective of which country they belong to, and they come together and say, okay, this is something that humanity needs, let's go after it. Panama Papers, for example, is a big example of it. Although we see Panama Paper in a very different context, but it's one big example where journalists around the world, like global journalists, came together and said, okay, this is data that we have, and we will make sure that this data is deciphered, written, and then published on one and the same day. The whole world will know who did what, and it has exposed a lot of people. It has also endangered the lives of journalists. Journalists also try to save their lives from organized corruption and crime around the globe, which is hand in glove with each other by their journalist unions like World Investigative Journalists Union and other organizations, Journalists Sans Frontiers, uh, which is a continuous struggle because in global journalism, the threats are also global. Like you can't run away because if there are 30, 40, 50, 100, 200, like I think 600 journalists participated in 300 or 600 in the Panama Papers. So all these journalists were scattered around the world and they just published on one day and they were challenging the most powerful in their countries. So where to go, basically. But somehow they did survive. Some of them didn't, but it was a difficult task. But that's one of the greatest advantages of global journalism right now. Although international journalism might be getting weaker and we are at a loss understanding what the new international journalism would be, how would we tell the story, and what benefit would we do to our profession by following into the footsteps of those whose time has gone. But we see that if we look at themes that international journalism, by coming together, follow, there is a lot of hope. And technology could be a big disadvantage in terms of money that governments have, and they can have access to technology and also resort to a lot of surveillance, which will make lives difficult for general publics as well as journalists. But at the same time, we see technology as a support to ideas that were earlier buried under different pretexts, like something that is not good for any nation state or a global narrative or certain media organizations, vested interests or politics or big money. We see that there is a possibility that we can unshackle ourselves from all these restraints and develop a global narrative which is more humane, which is more good for humanity. So that's a brief introduction for today. And I'll just stop it here.